What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today I want to try another one of these tier maker videos and do a power ranking of the Tyranids faction. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing Tyranids specifically is that obviously I have played a crap ton of games with Tyranids, and really it's the one faction in the game that I feel comfortable with sort of exploring holistically. Whereas the other factions in the game, I think I can talk pretty well about the powerful units and combinations in them. There aren't any other factions in the game where I actually have played basically everything, so I think I do have a little bit more experience talking about Tyranids specifically. Now, obviously, I also feel like I should go ahead and explain the ranking system that we'll use. Obviously, we're just an S through F tier list on Tier Maker here, but the basic benchmarks are that I'm going to be putting units in S tier that I'm going to be trying to fit into basically every list that I make. A tier units are units that I will fit in depending on the archetype, and then all the way down to C, B, and C tier units are probably units that are mostly mainstays, but aren't particularly exciting or novel in and of themselves. Whereas down in the bottom by D and F are units that I think sort of functionally don't work very well, and outside of very specific builds, I don't think I would put them into a list. So with that out of the way, let's get into ranking these units. And starting off with the Toxicrene, I'm going to go ahead and put Toxicrene in C tier here. It is an interesting unit if you're building into a Nidzilla style archetype where you're trying to fit in a bunch of monsters. It's not super expensive at 150 points, and its melee damage output is pretty significant, especially given that it can also contribute to its damage output with its ranged attacks. That said, it's not the most impressive chassis. It's a pretty average at T7 and 12 wounds, with only a 3+ armor save, and it is a little pricey at 150 points. I think I mentioned in my initial Tyranid point cost video that I would like to see this down to its 8th edition point cost, and it would be, I think, a really reasonable selection then. But when it's trying to compete against something like an Exocrine at 170, it's very difficult to fit that into the list. Now, the next on the list is the Moloch, and this monster did get a bit of a buff in the Psychic Awakening with its stratagem that it can use to buff its Terror from the Deep roll. But that said, I've never really seen Molochs as being a particularly efficient unit. They aren't that hard to kill with only toughness 6, and they don't really hit hard in melee either. Terror from the Deep is a nice ability, especially on a smaller board where they can really sink a lot of mortal wounds into units. But the restrictions that it has and the sort of short range of the mortal wounds it does, especially, and not to mention the fact that it only does a couple mortal wounds, and when you're trying to deal with big, tough units a lot of times in this edition, that gets a little bit dicey. I'm going to go ahead and put the Moloch at D here. Next up is the Tyrannocyte. I do like the Tyrannocyte a lot, or at least I did in 8th edition, but unfortunately, the fact that deep striking is a little bit less consistent now in 9th, given that units can be screened out much more easily, means that the Tyrannocyte's deep striking isn't that great, especially since the added benefit of combining strategic reserves with Pheromone Trail means that you can bring a similar style of unit with a Lictor for a lot less points. That's combined with the fact that the Tyrannocyte not only went up in points cost, but all of its weapons went up in points cost as well, which makes it much less efficient as a gun platform. That said, being able to fit 5 Barb Stranglers I think is pretty interesting, and even for Venom Cannons, it's okay. I'm going to go ahead and put the Tyrannocyte, let's put it in D. We'll put it in D sort of at the top, I guess, with an asterisk that I think there are still builds with Tyrannocytes that are probably still relevant. Or if you want to play a Mimi Jormungandr list like we did in 8th edition, I think I have a battle report on the channel where I played 10 of them. And just blew people up with Venom Cannons, which is pretty fun and still pretty reasonable, but not very cost effective. Next up, we have the Broodlord. We'll go ahead and put the Broodlord in B just for his raw stats alone. Broodlords, obviously in 8th edition, were incredibly powerful, and with the nerfs to Gene Stealers in 9th, he's going to be seen a lot less. That said, the relative power level of combat characters in 9th edition feels a little bit less stratified to me. Now that sort of Space Marine Smash Captains are much more difficult to fit into lists, you can bring kind of these mid-level combat characters like the Broodlord, and they can really mix it up with small units of like 5 Intercessors and things like that a little bit more reliably. I don't normally take Broodlords in my list, but I definitely could see, in some circumstances, like upgrading a Neurothrope to a Broodlord or something like that. Next up, we have the Carnifexes, and I'm going to go ahead and just mesh together all of the different varieties of Carnifexes here so we don't leave any behind and end up having to retread my thoughts on them. Unfortunately, the Carnifex chassis sort of as a whole is monumentally overcosted. That's another unit, a lot like the Toxicrene, that I think would probably have been fine at its 8th edition points cost, but got a massive points increase for basically no discernible reason. They're not very difficult to kill, and this is an edition where if you are bringing those sort of semi-armored units, you really need them to be very difficult to take out. They get swamped by Obsec very easily, and they don't do an incredible amount of damage back. They can do a little bit, and now you can sort of bring them with a little bit more of a mixed arms role, where they're bringing maybe a non-blast bioweapon alongside their melee weapons, and they can shoot into melee, and that's kind of fun. But altogether, I think it's too expensive. I do think that there are some lists for Carnifexes that can just spam melee versions, and you're just trying to hold the center of the table, and that's probably a pretty reliable list archetype, but you basically have to be building your entire list around it. They also lost a little bit of... I really want to put them somewhere between C and D here. I think in some lists they could work fairly okay, but I don't know if those lists are ever going to get more than mediocre. We'll put them sort of at the top of D here with the Tyrannocyte as well.
This is Trevi from the future coming in with a quick note. I just realized that I didn't talk about Old One-Eye at this stage of the review, and so I'll just touch on him real quickly. I do think that Old One-Eye probably has a place. I've never really rated him. He's one of the most powerful combat characters, certainly the most powerful combat character in the faction, I think, but has lost a lot of efficiency in 9th edition thanks to the hit roll benefit modifier rules, and in addition he's a character, so he's a little bit harder to screen. That said, his new look out sir rule, where the any Carnifex will stop him from being targeted by range attacks, is really cool and really interesting, and I do think that he is an important unit to sort of have on the table and bully the middle. I wish he had an invulnerable save. That would really push it over for me, so I would put him around C tier, I think, for Old One-Eye, but I didn't have him in this list, so I do apologize for that. But yeah, Old One-Eye probably around C tier, I think.
Next up, it looks to me like we have two pictures of the Death Sleeper here. I think I think the Death Leaper is just listed twice, so that's fun. Go ahead and rate the Death Leaper and Lictor together simultaneously. I actually really like Death Leaper, despite the fact that it got a pretty big nerf in 9th edition, now that it doesn't benefit from being -2 to hit. But there are a lot of effects in the game that give you +1 to hit, which means that the Death Leaper's -2 will sometimes just cancel that out. The big downside is how much more expensive it is than a Lictor. It's almost double the cost at 65 points versus the Lictor's 37. And a lot of times when I try to put a Death Leaper into the list, I end up cutting it for just to fit some more infantry, or just to cut a little bit of chaff. I'm going to go ahead and put the Lictor up at B tier here. I do think the Lictor itself is, and we'll put Death Leaper up there as well. We'll put them in the same category. I think there's rarely a reason not to upgrade a Lictor to Death Leaper. There's obviously you get a variety of benefits from it. Death Leaper being a character means that you could potentially screen her with infantry once she pops in. She does have that Lictor keyword, so she still benefits from the Lictor stratagems, which is very nice. And she's just better at fighting altogether, which is pretty solid. So if you do have that extra, whatever it is, 28 points to upgrade a Lictor into a Death Leaper, that's fine. I think that's a pretty reasonable place to spend them. But if you are just trying to bring what a Lictor brings into your list, just doing it for the base 35 is also okay. Obviously, you are bringing Lictors into your list, not only for the Pheromone Trail combo that I mentioned before, where you can spend the CP to strategic reserve a unit, then also spend an additional CP for the Pheromone Trail stratagem, and that allows them to deep strike in next to the Lictor, overriding the normal strategic reserve deployment rules. But the other thing you're going to be doing is potentially, in some circumstances, you can bring in the Lictor for that ability to ignore Overwatch. Also, small units that are easily to fit into table quarters that deep strike just by themselves are really important to score secondaries like Line Breaker and Engage on all fronts. And Lictors, of course, can perform actions being infantry. All of those are just good things to have in your list. And if you're not bringing Ripper Swarms, I think a Lictor is a pretty good option as well. Ripper Swarms obviously have the ability to obsec and fill up your troops allotment, which is nice, but Lictors are smaller, they're easier to hide, and they are infantry, so they can perform a lot of those actions. So I do think actually the Lictor is a pretty good unit. I'm actually kind of let's actually we'll set them in front of the Broodlords, and I'm almost considering bumping them up to A tier. To be honest, the more I think about it. Next up is the Dimacaron Forge World unit. Unfortunately, I think one of the most asked about units in Tyranids in general. It's one of the coolest models in the faction, and it's just such an interesting design of a model with its like sort of weird thorax, little claw maw thing. Unfortunately, it's just sort of fundamentally flawed as a design. It's basically a Trigon chassis, which is already not great. 14 wounds, it's fine, but toughness 6 means it gets killed a lot by a lot of stuff, especially in the meta currently, where we're looking at a lot of toughness 6 and 7 strength weapons, or where we're looking at a lot of strength 6 and 7 weapons that are really designed to kill sort of Primaris infantry that also just kind of incidentally pick up Dimacarons as well. Not to mention the fact that they are just monumentally overcosted. Coming into 9th edition at just massive 210 points for a model with no ranged presence whatsoever. It's entirely melee, and it's only got 6 attacks. Like, it's not even, it's hardly even gonna kill a like a Primaris infantry unit. Just garbage tier, unfortunately. I was really hoping we would see a big points break on these guys. Like, if we drop them to somewhere in the mid hundreds, I think maybe there's an opportunity to take a couple Dimacarons in a list. They are very fast, which is nice. And effectively have flying, which is really cool. Not to mention the fact that they don't really have flying with their leap or killer ability. They just ignore all vertical distances, which means they can like charge over obstacles and things like that, which is a really interesting ability to have. But it's just too many points for a really fragile body and not a lot of damage. Next up, we have the Exocrine, and I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody by putting the Exocrine at S tier. I sort of famously, I think I lambast myself a lot for just not being super impressed by the Exocrine when Psychic Awakening came out. But my problem there was I was only running 1 or 2, but in 8th edition, if you put 3 in your list, they actually sort of got exponentially more powerful as you went. I think there is a argument in 9th edition to drop down to 2, which is fine, but I honestly, I will try to fit 2 to 3 Exocrines into every single list I make, and I think it's kind of required for Tyranids at this stage. Next up, we have the Hive Tyrant. I'm going to move the Hive Tyrant and the Winged Hive Tyrant together because their profiles are basically the same. And interestingly enough, I think in 8th edition, the larger board and the way that ITC missions worked meant that you were almost always going to take a Winged Hive Tyrant when you could. But I think there's a really good argument to be made in 9th edition, now that the board is smaller and more focused on sort of just a big up knockdown drag out fight in the center, of just leaving your wings at home and taking the foot Hive Tyrant. Movement 9 base is like probably fine, to be honest. You can usually get those guys up into to the scrum just fine without having to take that huge enormous movement. Now, if you are taking a dedicated melee Hive Tyrant, you probably still want the wings so you can alpha strike things. But I don't think it's required, especially if you're bringing a variant with a Venom cannon or something like that. Now, I love Hive Tyrants. They're one of my favorite units in the entire game to play, and especially Winged Hive Tyrants. I like the fact that they engage in every phase of the game. They have really powerful psychics, in addition to being able to have really powerful shooting and pretty decent melee. The downside is that being sort of a jack of all trades, they're kind of also a master of none, which becomes problematic when you're trying to kit them out for something specific. You can't really put, a Tyranid, the monstrous biocannons are just laughably bad in a lot of situations. So kitting them out for melee is not great. Obviously, Venom Cannon, if you're taking a Hive or a Foot Hive Tyrant, is a pretty good thing to keep on those guys, just to have a little bit of ranged damage output, and they can kind of poke at long distances, which is nice to have. And then you follow it up with Bone Swords or Scything Talons. But the downside there also is that a limited number of attacks, only 4 attacks, and only strength 6 unless you murderous size them, which takes one of your adaptive physiology slots, means that they don't really punch very hard in melee either, and you kind of have to be banking CP to Voracious Appetite to reroll your wounds when they actually do get into melee, which is it's just disappointing. I wish they were 1 point of strength higher. That the 6 to 7 break is actually really important, especially when we're seeing a lot of toughness 6 and 7 vehicles on the table. As soon as you go into like a Scorpius Doom Rider and you're winning on 5s, it just feels bad. bad, man. That said, I think there are arguments to be made for the Smashy Winged Hive Tyrant, where you take 4 Scything Talons on that guy instead of any ranged weapons, and then you run him around with Murderous Size. And you can use Swarmlord to bounce him in and out of combat, and really just be an obnoxious piece of work for your opponent to deal with. I used to run that in 8th edition a lot. It was very powerful, and now that obscuring terrain makes it even harder to draw line of sight to those Winged Hive Tyrants, I think it's just gonna their stock is just gonna go up from here. I think I'm gonna put Hive Tyrants over at B. They're probably the low end of B. Unfortunately, they are very expensive, and like I said, they aren't amazing. But the fact that they are sort of difficult to kill monsters that can fit a lot of survivability into a pretty decent package, and also just do psychic stuff and exist in the middle of the table, it's fine. I normally don't take Hive Tyrants in my list outside of Swarmlord, but I do think that there is an argument to be made. Next up, we have Gargoyles. I'm going to go ahead and put Gargoyles in C tier here, and I actually don't feel great about this pick, to be honest, but I love Gargoyles. We'll put them ahead of Toxicrons. How about that? I do love Gargoyles. They got a bit of a pretty decent points hike in the transition from 8th to 9th, which I'm not sure was entirely warranted, and one of the issues with that they're going to have right now is that OBSEC is just going to absolutely blast them. That said, I think they are an excellent unit just to have, and if you have the opportunity to upgrade your Hormagants to Gargoyles, a lot of times you're going to be pretty happy with that. Having a base 12 inches of movement is really good, especially when you have multiple ways to double move them. It's excellent if you're trying to do things like raise the banners, because being able to move 12 inches to an objective, or potentially use a metabolic overdrive to move 24 inches to objective to then perform actions, is extremely powerful. The downside, obviously, is that bringing large units of 10 or more, or of higher than 10 models, is usually not that great, and in lower volumes they'll just get killed really easily. And for 7 points a model, it's a little bit of a hard ask, but I do think that they do have a place. And if you are looking for a unit to perform those actions and to try to grab those like engage on all fronts secondary objectives, that's where Gargoyles fit in. They're a very finessey kind of unit, and you do need a plan for them if you put them into your list, but I don't think that they are too expensive by any stretch of the imagination. Next up, we have Gene Stealers, and this is going to be a tough one, to be honest. Gene Stealers going up to 15 points in 9th edition is really rough. Not to mention the fact that they were already sort of being pushed out in 8th ed, just by the virtue of the enemies that they typically fought. They don't trade very well against Primaris a lot of times, and sort of a lot of just incidental melee will knock them out pretty quickly. Jumping up so many points in 9th ed, in addition to being just turbo nerfed by both the blast rules and the new combat rules, is just a 1-2 punch of death for these guys. Now, I will say, in the defense of Gene Stealers, that it looks to me like the meta may be shifting in a way where Gene Stealers is a profile that you want to have. Having a very fast, high volume, kind of reasonable damage weapon, a melee weapon, may be good right now, and there are situations where, like, man, I would love to have some Gene Stealers. Just, one thing that they did in 8th edition really well is just silver bullet kind of enemy forward operators. Like, they would just go in, they would absolutely eviscerate all of your opponent's scouts, all of your opponent's nurglings, all of those things, and then use overrun to like fall back into a building or something, and just do that turn after turn and kind of slowly attrition your opponent's army to death. There's nothing really else in the faction that does that quite as well, and I do think for that reason Gene Stealers may still have a place. Maybe I've been considering trying to fit like a unit of 15 or something into my lists just to have a kind of a counterpunch like that, but at 15 points it is very difficult. I'm going to go ahead and put them in C for right now. I don't think that they're something that you should be building for unless you have a very specific plan in mind for them, but I don't think that they are unplayable by any stretch of the imagination. Next up is the Harpy, and I think this is going to be another interesting discussion to have. Now, I will preface this and say that of the things on this list that I have the least experience with, the Flyers is probably the number one. But I think the Harpy in and of itself, I mean, it's an interesting pick. It obviously has the sort of a bomb equivalent ability with that Sporemine Cyst. It also has, and having some pretty decent ranged damage output with either 2 Venom cannons or 2 Stranglethorn cannons. It's nice to have, for sure. And obviously, as we've talked about with a lot of these picks, having access to a very fast unit to be able to score things like behind enemy lines is, or engage in all fronts, excuse me, I'm falling back into 8th edition terminology here, is really nice. It's very important. And just being able to run in and like engage stuff is typically going to be a pretty big deal in 9th edition, as you'll find. Just to, if you can tag a unit of infantry, they won't be able to get to an objective potentially. They're going to stop slow down your opponent's scoring or slow down your opponent's ability to contest you, which is really nice. The downside is that they aren't the cheapest unit. They're coming in at a base 155 points, which is a little bit pricey, and they're very easy to take out. They only have a 4+ armor save, only toughness 6. They're just going to get targeted down and die. So you probably get one turn of doing something cool with them, and then they just explode. For that reason, it's a hard pick for me. I think we put them at the bottom of C here, just for their mobility. I think that they can play pretty reasonably, but you can also sort of fulfill that role with deep strikers or things like Gargoyles that are going to be just a little bit more cost effective and bring that infantry keyword, not give up, bring it down, and not be that hard to kill. So, I mean, I think they're fine. I think there's an argument to be made for Harpies if you have a specific role in mind. And I guess we'll talk about the Hive Crown as well while we're talking about this. Is that on the list? Yeah, here we are. Here's the Hive Crown. The two are honestly kind of interchangeable. You probably want to be bringing Harpies for those Venom cannons, but the Hive Crown will definitely kill some more infantry. The little missiles that it has, they're like kind of fun, but I would probably be taking a Harpy because you get those Sporemines with it as well. Next up, we have the Harridan, and like the other flyers, this is going to be another thing that I don't really have any experience with, to be honest. I will say one thing that really kills the Harridan for me is just being a Lord of War. Taking up a Lord of War slot in this current edition is really bad. Not to mention the fact that things that are Titanic in general are typically fairly bad right now. Because the obscuring keyword doesn't do anything for them, dense cover doesn't do anything for them, there's no real way to protect them on the table. And they end up getting focus fired really hardcore and going down pretty quickly. And that's something that the Harridan's going to see a lot of. Its defensive profile is fine, but it's not good. It's easier to kill than almost any other knight on the table, and it costs twice as much, which just kind of sucks. Not to mention the fact that the table's smaller and it's just going to be harder to sort of maneuver this big idiot around. So I think I'm going to go ahead and place it in F. Yeah, probably just the bottom of F. I don't think I would touch a Harridan, to be honest. It's just too expensive. It needs to be, probably half of the points cost to be something that you would look at, I think, realistically. Talking about the Haruspecs, I think the Haruspecs kind of falls into the same role as the Toxicrene. If you're playing a kind of aggressive monster style of list, I think the Haruspecs is a pretty decent option, especially since it can really kind of realistically kill a pretty reasonable number of infantry. Kind of a bizarre design decision for the Haruspecs, and one that I think kind of torpedoes it from being relatively competitive is it's weirdly terrible weapon skill of 4. Like, this is a unit that you want to be fighting infantry and converting a high volume of attacks, and it just misses half of them, and that's going to be pretty obnoxious. It's also really expensive for kind of no reason. It costs the same as an Exocrine, which is, there's just no universe in which that should be true. But being really tough is very nice for this guy. It is a toughness 8. It has 13 wounds and multiple abilities to heal itself back up, which is pretty cool. And in an edition where we really want to be taking the center of the table and sitting on it, the Haruspecs, I think it has a place. That said, unless I would most likely leave it at home just because of that cost and that kind of unreliability. But I do think that if you are comboing it with some infantry that can provide it some OBSEC bodies, I think the Haruspecs is a pretty reasonable option to sit in the center of the table. Next up, we have the Hyrudual, and it looks like this is just going to be the barbed Hyrudual. Do we have the side one on here? I don't know if we do. So we may just talk about them both right now. Again, man, Titanic gets gets crushed so hard by this edition. It's really hard to justify a high placement for these guys. Being amongst the easiest monsters or sort of Titan equivalents in the game to kill is not a good look when a lot of terrain does not block line of sight to you now. And that's really going to hurt these the Hyrudual. Not to mention the fact that we really want to be fighting over OBSEC. And if you're spending, between 300 and 400 points for these big punchy monsters which are models that do not themselves have OBSEC and are going to lose out on a lot of objectives. That's too many points, man. Especially since a lot of the missions have 5 or 6 objectives and really spread the objectives around the table, you're going to find that if you're focusing on these big Titanic units, that getting them to play positions on the table where they can be relevant is going to be tough. Your opponent's going to be able to kind of outmaneuver your army, and while they are pretty fast, they're not that fast, and you do probably have to be bringing kind of Swarmlord to go alongside them. They need a lot of support to make work. I think the Bard Hyrudual at any of them is probably the best. I'm going to put them at the bottom of D. There's some combos you can build with them, and you can make them relatively tanky. You can give them -1 to be hit, which is good because dense cover doesn't affect them at all. You can give them the 5+ invulnerable save. You can make them Leviathan for a 6+ ignore. You can just stack a bunch of buffs on them to make them as tanky as possible. They're never going to be as tanky as just a normal Imperial Knight, which is a little bit obnoxious, but they do shoot back pretty hard. You can also, if you wanted to, you can play them in Chronos and Symbiostorm, some of those big bio cannon shots, which is fine. And I do think there is now a argument for the Scythe Hyrudual to bring that big 2d6 flamer shot to just fight in the center of the table, which seems pretty good. But yeah, man, they're just too expensive for what they're doing. And the Titanic units in general have just been totally screwed by the mechanics in 9th edition. Oh, here's the Scythe Hyrudual. I'll put him back here. Next up, we have Hive Guard, and I think I like the Exocrine, unsurprising. We're going to put Hive Guard up in S tier. They're another unit that I think probably deserves to be in every single Tyranid list. They already should have been in every single Tyranid list back in 8th edition. The downside was that the short range made them a little bit awkward, especially if your opponent had artillery that could shoot back at them. But now that the table's smaller, they're just way better. And also you typically have more CP to double shoot them too. So they're just really good. I think a lot of lists are now bringing 2 units of Hive Guard, and I think that's pretty reasonable as well. So I just bring Hive Guard, man. They're they're just really, really solid. There's going to be some matchups where they get a little bit screwed. I think Sororitas in particular, with a Valorous Heart ignoring 2 points of AP makes them a little bit tough. But it's fine. I mean, you could just play through that matchup, kind of rely on your Exocrines a little bit to deal that damage, and your opponent fails 3+ armor saves sometimes, so it's okay. But a lot of times, having Tyranids sort of moving from the position where they were in 8th edition, where their AP was typically kind of capped at AP2, but now that we're bringing Exocrines in addition to Hive Guard, having a lot of AP 2 to 3 is kind of an interesting direction for the faction to go, because we typically will punch through a lot of power armor these days, which is really nice to see. Next up, we have Hormagants. I'm going to put Hormagants at A tier. It's kind of A tier, I think, as we go down the list, is going to be kind of uninspired, I guess. There's going to be a lot of kind of random troops in here that are good and you should put in your lists, but aren't particularly flashy, and I think that's where Hormagans go. They're a little bit more expensive than Termagants, so a lot of times you're going to see Termagants but get brought just to fill out your list as big as possible. Hormagants are going to be the same thing, but they bring that extra point, or the extra 2 points of speed, and that's really, I think, what's important here for Hormagants. Their ability to pile in consolidate 6 inches is actually really relevant as well, because it lets them kind of do interesting, a lot of the same interesting combat shenanigans that they did in 8th edition, but now they also just we can do that without worrying about new coherency rules because they can move so fast and jump around. That also makes them better at like sort of nabbing objectives from people and entirely moving into quarters for engaging all fronts. They're just good. It's just nice to have base speed 8 infantry on the table. Hormagants are fine. I think normally you would take Termagants over them just for the cost, but if you have the points to upgrade, I would certainly do it. Next up, we have a Maliceptor. This is a little bit of an interesting one. I think a lot of people are really high on the Maliceptor right now. I am a little bit worried about Maliceptors specifically because it currently in the meta, a lot of the weapon profiles that we're seeing are around sort of strength 6-ish. And that's the one strength that Maliceptors do not want to see on the table. Strength 6 weapons means that encephalic diffusion basically doesn't benefit you from them at all. Your toughness, if you have toughness 5 stuff, which is basically literally just Hive Guard, or then that will help. But toughness 7 doesn't care, toughness 8 doesn't care, and toughness 4 doesn't care. I guess toughness 3 does, so it could benefit your Termagants and stuff. But I mean, if that's where you want to spend 2 CP at the start of your opponent's turn, then okay, that's a lot of CP. They also, I think, Maliceptors don't benefit quite as much as other Psychers have in the transition to the new edition, just because they're not characters, so they can't perform most of the psychic actions that we have. I think if they could ritual, if you could just sit a Maliceptor in the middle of the table and attempt a ritual 5 times over the course of the game, like that's pretty reasonable. That guy will get you 15 points, and there's nothing really your opponent can do about it. But they can't do that, unfortunately, and they're just, like, they don't really do anything besides smite. So I haven't really been feeling that I've needed a Maliceptor. That said, I think I'm going to put them in B, probably mid to high B tier. Just because they're hard to kill. That's a good. If you don't have a lot of other Psychers in your army, them being able to smite and Psychic Scream with +1 is it's just nice. It's nice to have. The Psychic Overload is bad. Basically, never do it. But just dropping 2 smites into people and having them engage you and not really being able to kill you through that 4+ invulnerable save. It's kind of the same reason that Hive Tyrants are pretty decent. It's just nice. It's fine. Yeah, they're fine. I guess I would probably take Hive Tyrants over them. I think Hive Tyrants a little bit more expensive. It's about 30 points more expensive when it's kitted out, but it also fights in melee well, and the Maliceptor does not. So yeah, they're kind of in the same realm than Hive Tyrants. I guess I would probably just usually take a Hive Tyrant over a Maliceptor though. So that's too bad. The +1 to cast on Maliceptor is very nice to have. Next up, the Malinthrope. I haven't really found in my lists that Malinthropes have been necessary. That said, it's a really good unit. Just good. It's just a 3-inch aura of -1 to be hit. It's just really solid. And there's going to be some lists that you build where Maliceptors or Malinthropes, excuse me, are really important. So I mean, yeah, you just take them. That's fine. I think they're okay. Not really much to say about that. They don't really do anything, so they just sit around and look cool. I guess, well, they're not infantry, so they can't perform actions, so that's kind of unfortunate. I kind of wish they had 1 cast. I wish they were a Psyker with 1 cast. That would make me like them a lot better, but yeah, I don't know. They're just okay. One thing to keep in mind is that the character protection changing is a big deal for Maliceptors or Malinthropes. That said, they're usually within 3 inches of the units that they want to protect anyway, so most of the time they're going to be sitting next to Exocrines or something like that to keep them alive. And that character role won't be that big of a detriment for you, but it is one thing to keep in mind that back in the day you could just sit them on a back objective and be fine. Next up we have Neurothropes, and we're going to go ahead. I don't love putting Neurothropes in S tier because they're not really flashy. Again, they're not like as exciting as an Exocrine, but man, they're just really efficient HQ choices. They just like, man, I couldn't imagine playing Tyranids without Neurothropes, to be honest. For 95 points, you just get a cast and a basically invincible body. It's just like they're a smash captain with a storm shield, basically defensively, and they fly, which is nice. They're infantry, so they can perform actions. They're characters, so they can perform psychic actions. It's all gravy for them. They reroll 1s to cast, so their casts are a little bit more consistent than stuff like Broodlords, which I think are also kind of comparable for that reason. And yeah, it's just nice to have a Neurothropes around, man. They're just nice. They're not exciting, but oh boy, do they make the faction kind of tick. Next on the list is Pyrovors, and this is
A really interesting one that I don't know. I don't know where to place them. I think the correct answer is somewhere in C, probably high C tier. They're so matchup dependent. There's a lot of matchups where a 10-inch range strength 5 gun is going to do no good. You're playing against Space Marines, and these guys, they're toughness 4, they get picked up by bolt guns. They're just going to get blasted off the table and not do anything, and that's sad. But there's going to be some matchups where they go into sort of a high model count melee army, and they just mince it up, and your opponent tries to charge him with orc boys, and you spend the CP to Overwatch and you kill 20 of them with this unit of Pyrovors. It's really inexpensive. You can outflank them, you can pheromone trail them, but they're so one-dimensional. They just shoot a flamethrower, and then any matchup where having a flamethrower is good is going to be good, and any matchup where it's not, they're going to be bad. Do have some idiosyncrasies with them. They're not very fast, which doesn't really make sense for a unit with a flamethrower. They also have a huge base, which they're on like a Hive Tyrant size base, which is enormous. And that makes it very difficult for them. If you're taking units more than one, you can take up to 3. But if you take more than one and you reserve them in, then they have a tough time actually getting all of their bases in range of you, because if you can't line them up in a big long line, then they're not going to hit you very hard, which is just weird. It's just kind of bizarre. They have an acid maw, like AP -3 melee attack, but like only 2 attacks to hit on 4s. They have like I guess they're strength 5, which is nice, but 4+ weapon skill is really bad. They're just a bizarre unit, to be honest. They also kill, they mortal wound your own guys sometimes because they explode. It's what a weird unit. Fortunately, they're very inexpensive for what they are for 4 wounds, which is nice to have. And their weapons are assault, so they can advance and shoot them. They are infantry, so they can double tap with single-minded annihilation if you really want to hit somebody with like 3d6 flamers a second time, which is pretty cool. But I don't know. They're just a weird unit to try to evaluate. Next up, we're talking about Raveners, and Raveners are a weird one. I think the internet's very high on Raveners, and I have no idea why, to be honest. Look like warriors, but they have a 5+ save instead of a 4+ save, and that 1 point of save is a big freaking deal. They also do not obsec, which is just sad. But on the flip side, they can have ranged weapons in addition to their melee weapons. I think normally you wouldn't want to. You would want to just take them as cheap as possible. But they can deep strike. You can put 6 of them in a unit. You can give them all death spitters, and they can jump in and shoot something. I think that's fine. They're good at shooting, but they are pretty good at dicing infantry up. They come in, if they have 2 pairs of Scything Talons, they come in with 5 base attacks, which is pretty good. And if you have Red Terror in your list, they hit on 2s and reroll 1s, which is also solid. That said, only strength 4, and like I said, only a 5+ save is going to be a little bit awkward. They're going to get diced up pretty hard. I think almost any time I would take a Ravener, I would rather just take a Warrior and have that obsec and that +1 save available. And anytime I want to bring them in order to deep strike them. I don't think they shoot well enough to justify the expenditure of giving them guns to shoot with when they deep strike in. They're not reliably even going to kill like 10 infantry on an objective typically, without a lot of help. And they're like sort of a large footprint of a unit, especially if you're bringing the full 6. So they're not quite as easy to jump into back corners and things as like Ripper Swarms or Gargoyles or something are. So I think I would put them kind of high D tier. I could be persuaded otherwise. I think a lot of people like Raveners a lot. And there's some interesting tech you can do with Jormungandr. You can have them reroll hits, and you can have them bring additional stuff with them with the Jormungandr stratagem, which is really cool. But like I said before, deep strikings is sort of weird in this edition currently. So I don't think I just don't think that they're really worth anything. You just spend your energy elsewhere, to be honest. There's probably a combination in there that may be relatively good with Raveners if the community works it out, but I'm not sure that it's better than just bringing sort of the standard stuff that's at the top of the list.
It's Trevi from the future here again, realizing that Red Terror wasn't on this list. So we're going to do her alongside the Raveners, just like we did with Old One-Eye. I do think that Red Terror is basically along the same lines as Lictors and the Death Leaper. a pretty good archetype of unit, it being a character as well as infantry and with the ability to innately deep strike. That's all pretty decent. Her stats aren't terrible. She's okay at fighting. Not, it can't really go toe to toe with other combat characters, but can kind of hold her own against infantry. Okay, and if you are bringing Raveners to kill infantry, like I mentioned, they can get up to 5 attacks, and you're hitting on 2s with reeling 1s. That's pretty decent amount of just raw attack output. Then I think that you probably want to bring Red Terror along. It's basically, I think she's going to be somewhere around C tier. Not basically the same archetype of unit as a Lictor, but Lictors bring a lot more utility, whereas Red Terror is just there to deep strike and sit on an objective somewhere. I've tried to fit Red Terror in a lot of my lists in the past. It's usually it's the first thing to get cut, but I do think that there is a list out there for her. Next up is Rippers. This is going to be another sort of uninspiring one for A tier. Rippers they've always been excellent. They're excellent now. They have OBSEC, which is great. They are 36-point troops units, so that you can fill up patrol detachments potentially if you really need to, and you can just deep strike them in corners for to grab engaged in all fronts or line breaker. If you're not bringing like a Lictor or something to do that, absolutely bring a unit of Rippers. I think I always have at least 1 or 2 of those 2 units in my list regardless. The big downside of Rippers is that they aren't infantry, so they can't perform actions, whereas Lictors are. But the upside is that they're troops in the OBSEC, and I think that edges them out above Lictors just a little bit. You can also like cheekily give them -1 to be hit with the 1 CP stratagem, and there are going to be some situations in some lists where you take like units of 5 Rippers to jump into backline objectives and give them -1 to be hit and just chill for the entire game. I think that's fine, and that's probably a pretty reasonable archetype as well. So yeah, love me some Rippers. They're just great. They're just really good units to sit on objectives, which is how you win the game, it turns out. Next up is Swarmlord, and this is a controversial one. The internet is really low on Swarmlord right now, which is flabbergasting to me. Swarmlord has, in my opinion, has done nothing but get better as the edition switched over. He did go up a couple points. He went up 20 points, but honestly, the thing that he does is so unique in the entire game, to be honest, in his Hive Commander ability, that you're just going to spend those 20 points almost anywhere you go. So that doesn't really feel like a big issue. Like, that's 5 Termagants. You're going to spend, like, you're going to tell me that Hive Commander is not worth 5 Termagants? Like, get out of here. He is also, but he also is just kind of more difficult to kill, given that a lot of times he has to commit on round 4 is when he dives on his opponent, and that gives your opponent only 2 turns of shooting to kill him, and a lot of times he'll just kill whatever can kill him, and then he kind of anchors the end of the game. And there's a lot of times where I straight up win the game because Swarmlord goes ham and kills a bunch of my opponent's stuff on objectives and just takes the objectives himself. He is just incredibly good and amazing. There's some interesting things. I like to talk about this almost every time I talk about Tyranids, but there's some cool things that he does that are important. He can let you cast psychic powers and fall back in the same turn with Hive Commander, because Hive Commander happens after the psychic phase, so you already will have cast your psychic powers, and then you can go ahead and fall back with Hive Commander. He can also let you cast psychic spells and then move out of line of sight, which is really important. And obviously, moving forward is important currently in the meta, or in the mission packet, just because it's you want to get on those objectives. Whether he's A or S tier, I don't know. I think I'm going to put him in S because he fits in almost every one of my lists. But and I also should mention that the thing that I mentioned earlier, that when we talked about the Broodlord, where the relative power level of combat characters has kind of compressed a little bit. Swarmlord kind of got outclassed by Space Marine captains a lot, and you see a lot less of those specific Space Marine captains around, and so he can sort of commit much more readily into, especially like Imperium armies, because they don't have that one kind of silver bullet character that can go bean him in the head. And a lot of times you get to the end of the game and there's like one Intercessor Sergeant with a Thunderhammer on the other side of the table, and Swarmlord's like, he's just ready to go and chop some dudes up. He's great. I love him. The only downside to him is that I sometimes run out of CP to Voracious Appetite him, and he like flubs around a combat or something. But just be more careful with your CP and try to be more CP efficient. And if you have 1 or 2 CP for him at the end, he can just pull games out for you. He's incredible. We have Termagants next. We're going to go ahead and put them in A. Basically like Hormagants. We talked about the archetype. They're just good infantry to have and run up the table and be really good. A tier here is just the saddest tier. It's just a bunch of really good troops options. But next up is the Turvagon.
This is an interesting one. I've been talking to some members of the community who are having good success with Turvagons and building lists around spamming Termagants. I haven't quite seen that as much myself. Turvagons, it seems like, typically are taking one of your adaptive physiology slots to get that 5+ invulnerable save, so that they're a little bit more tankier. On the flip side, they are kind of just a obnoxious model to kill. They're toughness 8, 14 wounds. They have that kind of gorgeous Tyrannifex stat line, which is very nice. And if you give them an ignore, like a Leviathan, High Fleet trait, or Catalyst, they can be very difficult to kill, and your opponent just doesn't want to deal with it. That said, they don't do anything unless your opponent is not killing units of Termagants, which is they probably should be. I don't know. I don't know what your opponent is doing if they're not killing Termagants. So I very rarely see units of Termagants not wiped out when my opponent shoots at them. So the Turvagon's ability to regenerate them isn't super exciting to me, to be honest. And obviously you have to spend reinforcement points to bring additional units of Termagants onto the table, so they don't really even contribute that way anyway. Having a cast and having another Synapse creature on the table is nice sometimes, but for 200 points, it's a lot. It's a ton of points. I'm going to put them in C. I think there are builds that will use them, but I don't really rate them too highly myself. Next up, we're talking about the Trigon. I mentioned this is going to also include the Trigon Prime. And it's similar to what we talked about with the Moloch and the Damacaron a little bit as well. The Trigon just doesn't really work. It's unfortunately toughness 6, which is real bad to begin with. A lot of weapons in the game are going to be wounding it on 2s or 3s or 4s, which is really not where you want to be without any additional survivability. You shouldn't expect it to do anything without dumping a whole bunch of resources into sort of adrenal websing it and getting a bunch of bonuses to charge out of Deep Strike. You shouldn't really expect it to do very much the turn it comes in. You could just deploy it on the table and charge, but that's a little dicey, and it's not the fastest thing in the world. Movement 9 is fine, and you can double move it with Swarmlord or whatever, but the biggest issue is that once it gets there, it doesn't hit that hard. It's a 6 attacks, it's rank 7, which is fine, and hits for d6 damage, but a lot of times that doesn't sort of kill your opponent, and you need to murdericize it to really get it anywhere, in which case you're not giving an invulnerable save and you're taking one of your adaptive physiologies away. And I keep mentioning the adaptive physiology slots in the faction right now, and I think once we get to Warriors, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in 9th edition, I haven't really felt like those physiology slots have ever been more in demand than they are in 9th edition. I think having both of them open for your infantry is really important, and having this big dumb idiot who kind of requires you to fill a slot with him is a little bit obnoxious. That said, I mean, it's nice. He can blow up a tank maybe if he comes in and you spend a bunch of CP on him, but I don't really rate it. I'll put it sort of high D tier, I guess, just with these other monsters that are just mediocre. We're talking about the Tyranny Prime next, and I think it's unfair to talk about the Prime and not talk about Warriors, so we'll talk about them together. I think Primes are terrible, man. They are so disappointing. But the downside is that Warriors are so terrible at shooting that if you ever want to shoot with a Warrior, having a Prime in the list is really nice. That said, I always refer to them as a Prime tax because it's like this 70 point, or I guess they're like 85 points now once they're kitted out. It's just this 80 point idiot who doesn't contribute to the game. He's not that good at fighting. He's not that good at shooting. And he's just there to buff your Warriors who are already not that good at shooting. So it's nice to have it if you're sort of comboing off with Kronos and you want to give them a bunch of bonuses to hit and you want to explode their Venom cannon shots. That's really cool. But you could just do it on an Exocrine and it's like free. You don't have to spend 70 points on this dumbass. And a lot of times I would much rather have a Psyker in that slot anyway. This guy's not supporting the army in any other way besides maybe sometimes offering some Synapse. And a Neurothrope can also cast Catalyst and smite things. So I hate Primes. I just think they're terrible. We're going to put them in D. But I love Warriors. So Warriors, we're going to go top of A here. I think if you are building specifically either to shoot with Warriors, if you want your Warriors to deal damage, you should probably try to fit a Prime in there. He's a big damage multiplier on Warriors, but it's like the first thing that I end up cutting if I can't find enough points in my list, because he doesn't do anything else by himself. That said, warriors themselves are really good, not because they do damage, but because they tank a lot of damage now. A lot of the metagame is aiming at 2 damage weapons, which means Unyielding Chitin, their 1 CP strat to keep to reduce damage against them by 1 in the shooting phase is really good right now. There's going to be a lot of Tempest shots going at them that's going to hit for 1, which is fine. And then also they with the Adaptive Physiology enhanced resistance, they can ignore 2 points of AP, and they can keep around a 4+ armor save through most of your opponent's shooting. A lot of there's going to be some things that hit them for -3 and punch right through that armor save. But once you buff them up with either Catalyst or the Leviathan 6+ ignore, they become very difficult to kill, and you can further combo that with things like Maliceptors, with Venomthropes, with a bunch of different ways to keep them alive, with just putting them in cover, Jormungandr potentially, and it's all good. It's just great. The downside, it feels bad kind of having to put them in A tier because, man, do they are they kind of uninspiring. They don't do any damage, and they aren't quite as tanky as you would want them to be. They're not like sort of these Grey Knight Paladin, like Adeptus Custodes level of tankiness. They will die in 2 turns rather than 1, whereas the rest of the Tyranid army will die in 1 turn. So, but dying in 2 turns means that they have a full round of standing on objectives, and that's very important. Unfortunately, I think they do require the unyielding or enhanced resistance physiology right now, which is one of the reasons that a lot of these picks that take up adaptive physiology slots are, I think, going to be a little bit lower. Having your objective secured infantry be as difficult to kill as possible is incredibly important for sort of maintaining your momentum during the game on the primary objective scoring. And if you sacrifice your adaptive physiology to do that, or to do something else with it, then you'll find out that Termagants are way easier to kill than 27 wounds of warrior standing on an objective. I typically will start all of my lists once I fit these big gun batteries to deal damage into my lists. I'll typically have 2 units of warriors and then a smattering of the other infantry in there. That's basically why this stuff is at the top, to be honest. But they're just really important to take the center of the table and be objective secured in the middle. And I think that they're one of the only units in the Tyranny Codex that can really do that reliably. Not to mention that they're troops, so they fill up troop allotments as well, which is very important too. Just a solid unit. Just don't be surprised if they bounce off your opponent's stuff. They're good at clearing sort of chaff infantry, but each warrior, I kit them out with just 2 pairs of Silent Talons to keep them as cheap as possible. And a single warrior with 2 Scything Talons hits about as hard as 1 Gene Stealer fighting against sort of light infantry. And so if you sort of keep in mind that this unit looks very intimidating but hits as hard as sort of half of a Gene Stealer unit, that kind of puts you in the right mindset. They can kill sort of toughest 3 guardsman equivalents all day, but once they punch a Primaris guy, they're just going to bounce off and maybe kill one of them. So don't expect them to really do any damage. They're just there to stand there and chill. And I wouldn't spend any points on their guns. That was one of the first mistakes I used in 9th edition using warriors. I kitted them out to the 9s. With the Venom cannons and the Kronos detachment and Symbiostorm and all this, and the Prime and all this stuff to get them going, and it just was not worth the expenditure. But that said, keeping them at 100, they're 192 points, I think, or with just a couple of them, just 9 of them sitting in a unit. That's fine. Just leave it at that. Pyrovors are the next one, and really interesting. I've seen a lot of mixed results with Pyrovors, but I think they're probably somewhere in B tier right now. There are going to be lists with 9 Pyrovors that just dominate the center of the table. It is pretty matchup dependent and it is pretty terrain dependent, but and I don't think that they're going to be quite as good as like this other stuff. But their ability to move block is very unique, and the ability to move block enemies from getting onto your objectives is very important. in 9th edition. If you can stop your opponent from getting to the middle of the table, then you will win on points. And that's good. Unfortunately, it does require you to kind of go ham into the Biovore game plan. And I don't think that's going to be 100% effective all the time, but it's probably fine. And I have yet to experiment with a lot of different Biovore builds, and I'm excited to give it a shot. But there's certainly the opportunity for Biovores to be very powerful in 9th edition. So we'll see how it goes as we get more and more results from the edition. But they're fine. Next up is the Tyrannifex, and I wish I had nice things to say about the Tyrannifex, and I do a little bit. I really like the acid spray build. I think it's really cool. And it's one of the most unique ranged weapons probably in the game. Like this big flamer that's multi-damage and can shoot twice and just could rip a tank off the table is really cool. The downside is that it's attached to this big 200-point idiot. So I played a lot of games with triple acid spray Tyrannifexes right as the edition came out. And man, the one that got there to shoot was really cool, but the other two all died immediately as soon as they moved out into line of sight of your opponent. I don't think that the Rupture Cannon build or the Fleshbore Hive build. I mean, the Fleshbore Hive build is just silly. You don't need it. This guy's only got a 4+ ballistic skill. If you're within 18 inches, just shoot the acid spray. It's going to do way more damage on average. So the Fleshbore Hive is just a waste of time. The Rupture Cannon build is the other interesting one. Obviously, it can pretty often stand still to shoot twice. You probably have it in Chronos to reroll once to hit. So it's probably getting 4-ish hits with a big las cannon equivalent gun through every turn, which is good. But the low cost of 200 points is, boy, is that a big price tag. And it's not like it's not going to die to return fire. The upside of exocrines, I think, is that they can move and fire those guns, and so they're a little bit more mobile. They can kind of deploy out of line of sight and move into line of sight and skirmish a little bit more, whereas the Tyrannifex has to sit there and basically start in full view of your opponent. Otherwise, it only gets to shoot half of its gunshots. And like a Contemptor Dreadnought's going to turn around and just rip this thing right off the table. So I think the acid spray, honestly, feels like the only reasonable. It also, I should mention as well that to that point, the exocrine is a lot more reliable when it's shooting. It doesn't degrade to a 5-up ballistic skill and then just sit there. It buffs itself to hitting on 4s, which is decent. It's not good, but it's decent. Whereas this thing, once it hits on 4s to start with, there's no benefit to hit, and then it degrades to 5s immediately and just misses a bunch, which is pretty silly. You think that Tyranids would evolve maybe some better eyes onto their gun bugs, but I guess not. And that makes that kind of low volume, high variance weapon like a Rupture Cannon really dicey. So I think the acid spray build on the Tyrannifex is the best. The downside is that it's not efficient at all. These things need like a 50-point decrease, I think, to be efficient. And then at that point they would be good and they would really be competing with an exocrine. But the fact that they only have an 18-inch range, have to stand still with that 18-inch range to get reasonable damage output. They can't advance and shoot either for some reason. They're only move 6. Like, they don't even go that fast. It's very silly. And a lot of times they're pulling resources away from the rest of your army that you really want to be doing damage with. Like, if you're going to metabolic overdrive these guys to get them up the table, to actually fire that acid spray at some point in the near future, you're not then metabolic overdriving your infantry, which, you need to be opsecking and stuff. This poor Tyrannifex, man. I want it to be good so bad. It's like, I like the big cool bugs, but we're going to put it, I think we're going to somewhere in D, maybe. Yeah, I'm gonna put Raveners in D. We're gonna put this guy probably high D. It's playable. There's some builds that you can play with it, but it's never gonna be efficient at the points cost that it's at right now. So next up we have Tyrant Guard, and this is a unit that I am actually interested to play around with a little bit. I think they're sort of fall into the same boat as Tyranid Warriors in that they're one of the few units that Tyranids have that are infantry that can get up in the middle of the table and they last for more than one turn. The downside is that they, unlike the Warriors, they are not in fact troops choices. So they are they're going to get killed. or they're going to get obsec'd away. You can mitigate that by just running Termagants around, but there's going to be situations where Tyrant Guard kind of dominate an objective. They just totally swarm it and kill everything on it, and then your opponent puts one Primaris Intercessor on it, and then they take it from you, and that's going to suck. That said, I mean, the stats on a Tyrant Guard are just solid. They're 3+ armor save, they're strength 5 times 5, they have multiple wounds. You can upgrade them with that enhanced resistance if you're not taking warriors. And man, a 3+ armor save ignoring 2 points of AP, as we've seen with Valorous Heart units, is just obnoxious. It just sucks to take down. And that's compounded by the fact that they're sitting on a toughness of 5 and have a pretty decent melee stat line as well. They also start with Rending Claws, which is pretty nice, given that they are strength 5, so they're coming in with an AP value to start with. You can upgrade them even more if you want. You can give them sort of the Power Fist equivalent in Crushing Claws. You can give them a Bone Sword, or a Lash Whip Bone Sword for an additional point of AP. And it's just like it's a decent melee profile, but it's not inspiring. They don't do a ton of damage in melee. They're just sort of mediocre in melee, but they can mix it up. They can find some Primaris Marines, and they'll do okay. So I think I'm going to put Tyrant Guard, probably controversially, over at B here. And not to mention that if you are playing a list with these foot Hive Tyrants, obviously Shield Wall is important, and being able to keep those Hive Tyrants alive with the Tyrant Guard is going to be a big deal. I think I'm going to give a unit of 6 Tyrant Guard a go, and we'll see how it does just following up with all of these swarms of infantry and just totally taking over an objective in the middle. They're also a little faster than warriors, which is sort of their bulk belies their agility, I think. And that's kind of nice. So, having an extra point of movement on the table there is going to be pretty good. So I think I'm a little up on Tyrant Guard, to be honest. They are an archetype of unit that fits really well into the meta currently, and we'll see how it goes with them. I'm not 100% sold that they're up here. They are a little expensive. I mean, a Tyrant Guard, each individual Tyrant Guard costs twice as much as a bare bones warrior, which is really tough pill to swallow. But having that toughness 5 and that 3+ armor save is a really, really big deal. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. This may be overrating them a little bit, but I do think that their stat line is pretty decent right now. Next up, we have the two remaining Thropes. We have Venomthropes and Zonethropes. Venomthropes, it's an interesting pick for Venomthropes. I liked them in 8th edition a lot. Just being able to spend 90 points to get your entire army -1 to be hit. Unlike a Malanthrope, they have a really big aura. They're 6-inch aura from each individual model instead of 3, and they are a unit, so you would cohere them out to be 2 inches from each other. So they would actually, the unit itself would actually be 8.5 inches long and then project 6 inches out from there. So you actually had this enormous swath of the table you could toe into to be -1 to be hit. And that would make them a lot more flexible. They also made pretty good sort of backline objective holders as well. I think a lot of those benefits don't matter as much in 9th edition. And for that reason, I have a hard time putting them at B tier. I would put them, I think, around C. So yeah, just poor Venomthropes. Also, limiting hit penalties to only cap at -1 means that a lot of times you're going to be getting your -1 to hit from the Horror instead of any of the Spore Cyst abilities that the Tyranids have. The real power of the Spore sort of skews in 8th edition was being able to stack -2 or -3 to hit on some stuff, and you can't do that anymore. And your opponent now, if they're -1 to hit, they just get to advance and shoot assault weapons for free, basically. They can sit next to dense cover and shoot through it or whatever. It's not as big of a deal as it was in 8th edition. And I think we're going to see these Spore Cyst models outside of a couple archetypes, maybe focusing on monsters and stuff. They're going to slowly fall out of the meta, I think. And the Venomthropes specifically, unfortunately, just not. They used to be, I think, a little bit more reliable than Malanthropes because they could project their bubble so much farther. But now that I don't think you need that same level of sort of board positioning, I think a Malanthrope does the same thing just fine. That said, they don't take up an HQ slot, which I guess is pretty relevant when you're comparing them to a Malanthrope. because you do run out of HQ slots in Tyranids pretty well, at least until we see if Swarmlord gets into a Supreme Command detachment. Oh, man. I hope. I didn't even mention that when we talked about Swarmlord, but Swarmlord may just become free in every list in terms of taking up an HQ slot, which would be super cool. Last up, we have Zonethropes, and I'm actually going to put Zonethropes. I'm going to put them in A, I think. This feels a little bit high for them, and honestly, I kind of probably overestimated their power level in 9th edition because I wasn't 100% sure if the smite rule would get changed that allowed you to smite multiple times. And if it didn't, man, Zonethropes would be the bee's knees. But it unfortunately did. You can't put out their, 2d3 plus 6 mortal wounds and just blow up a tank with that unit every turn, which would have been really cool. But instead, I mean, you just get a decent unit to sit in the middle of the table, kind of like we talked about Tyrant Guard just a second ago. Whereas Tyrant Guard require a adaptive physiology to get to sort of a similar level of survivability, Zonethropes are just a 3+ invulnerable save all the time. They're 1 less toughness, and your opponent doesn't mind engaging them because they don't really care about being punched by Zonethropes. But they have, I think, a pretty comparable level of survivability to Tyrant Guard, who have been upgraded with enhanced resistance. So, and then Zonethropes obviously don't require that enhanced resistance whatsoever. They're just going to be a 3+ invulnerable save all the time. And a lot of times, if you can fight your opponent's objective secured and kill it, Zonethropes can just hold down an objective. And a lot of chaff infantry, or even sort of elite infantry, stuff like intercessors with the Thunderhammer, are just going to bounce right off that invulnerable save. Characters a lot of times bounce off. Big things you would expect to run over them, they just become a speed block, just a speed bump. And then you can do interesting things like smite, then scream out of that unit, deal a bunch of mortal wounds, and then pull them out of melee with Swarmlord, for example. Then shoot into the unit that you just smited. Like, all sorts of interesting plays become available once you have a big damaging unit in the psychic phase. They're good at hitting and running with Swarmlord. Like they can move, they can chain. If you bring a unit of 5 so they aren't affected by the new coherency rule, you can chain them out and then drop 2 smites or a smite and a psychic scream into something, and then pull them back behind obscuring terrain with Swarmlord. Lots of really cool plays you can do with Zonethropes. I'm super high on Zonethropes right now. I'm sort of soured a little bit on them just because they are pretty expensive and they're a little unreliable. A lot of times you'll lose a couple models and then they just become basically a glorified Neurothrope, which feels bad. But your opponent has to dedicate so much very specific shooting to that unit. They can't just like turn around and shoot their Tempest launchers like in their last cannons into that unit because it's going to bounce off that warp field. Whereas they have to turn around and shoot like their sort of chaff killers at it, and it slowly whittles the unit down. But typically you'll have 2 Zonethropes left alive at the end of the game. Like, your opponent will try to kill them and just fail and have to kind of deal with these guys smiting them every turn. I really like Zonethropes. I think they're really cool. Now, I think that is all of the profiles for the game. We are missing a couple, just looking through the list real quick. We haven't talked about the Spore Assist. Spore Assist I think it lost its forward deploy ability, which is like, okay, thanks. Which is, I guess, fair because it could sort of take up a lot of real estate on the table. The fact that your fortification network is free now, which is nice. You don't have to spend a CP on it, which is pretty cool. I would maybe put a Spore Assist, maybe between C and D tier. I think they're kind of low level playability, but I think there's going to be some builds if you're trying to build around the Sporemine board control style of list. Sporosus will probably be okay. Just Sporemines themselves, I think, are the only things that we haven't talked about that weren't on this list. So Sporemines and Mucilid spores. I would mostly leave these guys at home. I'm not super high on buying them. I would just take Pyrovors, I think, if I did want to take Sporemines. You could Spore Field, and that might be good in some situations to just take I guess it's not even taking Sporemines in your list to just save the reinforcement points and then bounce Sporemines in with Spore Fields early. But Tyranids typically eat so many CPs that you don't really want to have to do that. So for the most part, I think I would leave Sporemines off the table. And mostly the same for Mucilid Spores. I don't think you really need to be playing around with that stuff for the most part. I've never really felt that it's been required to take any of the mine abilities outside of the ones that you get for free with other units. So I would probably put those units particularly down here or somewhere in here, and just get, use, they're mostly only there to be generated by other abilities, and so use them when you generate them from those. But I think that's going to be it for this Tyranid power ranking for today. I don't think that anyone is super surprised by this sort of the S tier ranking here. Some people may be surprised by Swarmlord, but those people are crazy. The Exocrines and Hive Guard specifically are where all of your damage output, if you're playing Tyranids, you should expect to come from. Between those and Smites, that's basically where all of the damage in the faction exists. Then you use units like Warriors, Zonethropes, Tyrant Guard, and to a lesser extent the smaller infantry to take the center of the table and to hold objectives, obsec away your opponent's objective, and break banners and deny them points and things like that, and just sort of reinforce your game plan. But most of your infantry, you'll find most of your infantry is dead by turn 3 or 4, and then you late game with Swarmy and your Neurothropes, and they run out and they just blast everybody to death with their psychic powers. Tyranids are, I'll go out on a limb and say they're not in a great spot right now. I think we definitely I was a little high on them when we did our faction ranking, and we put them at least 1 or 2 spaces too high, I think, from where they should be. They do have a lot of sleeper power in the fact that they are so mobile and they can jump around the table so hard. But unfortunately, they're just outclassed by the level of damage output that other factions can bring. And they used to be one of the factions in the game that was great at clearing hordes of infantry, and their infantry killing power has been up. I mean, mostly it's mostly Genestealers. Genestealers got up, costed so much that it's very difficult to maintain that identity in 9th edition. So there are going to be some factions, like I think Orcs are kind of coming back as a big meta player right now, just because they can put these big swaths of infantry on the table. The Tyranids would have been good in 8th edition, but in 9th they just don't have the beef to deal with it. And a lot of Space Marines and things are just going to shoot so much more efficiently than them that it's going to be tough to come back. That said, I mean, Tyranids will always be a very finesse army, especially with the abilities that they have currently. And if you're a good player, you'll get some wins with Tyranids for sure. They're going to be good at grabbing those board control objectives. You want to focus on those specifically. And then, like I mentioned before, is focus on your big guns, dealing all of the damage and clearing out opponent objective secured so you can take it with your own warriors and stuff like that. It's going to be interesting to see if any new builds sort of start to arise from Tyranids. Some of the monster builds focusing on maybe like Toxicrane Haruspex style models, maybe Hive Tyrants, maybe the Carnifexes. The Carnifexen would be cool, and I do think that there are lists with Carnifexes that are probably pretty viable. They just they feel pretty matchup dependent, because I think if your opponent just swarms them with dudes, they'll fall down pretty quickly. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you guys taking a look at my Tyranid faction ranking. And remember to check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, where you can get early access to videos and exclusive videos and all sorts of cool stuff like that. And thanks again for watching, everybody. Have a good one, and keep it classy, folks. Keep gribbling. Gribbly boys.